My name is on the audit and my signature is on the report, so I will begin the way I always begin, with what the records show. I was assigned in late September to conduct a quality assurance review of the Certified Surface Weather Observation Program at a Class C commercial airport in the northern tier of the country. I will not name it. Anyone who has worked in this field long enough will recognize the operation from the details, and anyone who has not does not need the name to understand what happened. The review was routine, triggered by an FAA cycle rather than any complaint. My scope covered the 24 months preceding my arrival, roughly 17,000 meter observations, 412 species, all runway condition assessments filed under the TALPA format, and the associated calibration histories for the ASOS array, the runway friction measuring equipment, the LLWAS network, and the two supplementary wind sensors at the approach ends of runway 14 and runway 32. I have been doing this work for 19 years. Before that, I was a certified weather observer myself for 6. I know what a clean log looks like. I know what a sloppy log looks like. I know the difference between a shift supervisor who trusts his observers and one who is quietly rewriting their work at the end of the night. I mention this because I want to be clear that the anomaly I found was not the kind of thing an inexperienced auditor would have flagged. It was not sloppy. It was, in a specific and troubling way, too clean. I began, as I always do, with the SPEC1 observations. Special reports are issued when conditions change significantly between the hourly meters, and they tend to be where observer judgment is most exposed. In a healthy program, you see species clustered around genuine weather, a wind shift with a frontal passage, a ceiling drop, a visibility restriction from fog or smoke. In an unhealthy program, you see species clustered around convenience, filed to cover a supervisor's back, or to justify a runway change that operations wanted anyway. What I found at this facility was neither. I found species clustered around aircraft arrivals. That by itself is not unusual. Wake turbulence, jet blast, and engine exhaust plumes can all produce brief, sensor-detectable changes in the surface environment, and a diligent observer will occasionally issue a SPECY or append a remark to a meter when such a change crosses the reporting threshold. The FAA's Federal Meteorological Handbook No. 1 explicitly permits, and in some cases requires, that operationally significant environmental disturbances be documented in the remarks section. In practice, at a mid-sized commercial airport, you might see 2 or 3 such remarks a month. At this airport, over the 24-month audit window, I counted 147. That count alone made me sit up. But it was the specific language of the remarks that made me stop drinking my coffee and start pulling supplementary records. I will reproduce, from memory and from my working notes, a representative example. The meter was time-stamped at 0347 local on a Tuesday in mid-February of the previous year. Wind was reported as 320 at 6 knots, visibility 10 statute miles, sky clear, temperature -11 Celsius, dew point -14, altimeter 30.12. Standard, quiet, winter overnight conditions. The remarks section read as follows, and I am transcribing it as it appeared. Wake Turb OBS ARS WY 32 following heavy, ACFT R approx 0344 Zulu, wind shift 280/12, G18 persisted 3 minutes 40 seconds, Vis temp RDCD 6 SM in exhaust plume, RWY 32 braking action, degraded patch reported by OPS2, friction in Sprickery, followed 12 minutes later by a SPECA documenting the wind shift's return to prevailing, and a runway condition report filed by the airfield inspector at 0411, noting fresh tire residue and moderate rubber deposit within the touchdown zone of runway 32, with a friction reading of 0.62 μu on the mu meter, degraded from a baseline of 0.71 at the previous shift's inspection. Everything about this record is normal. It is the kind of documentation you want to see. It is careful, technical, procedurally correct, and it triggered the appropriate downstream response: an inspection, a friction test, a rubber deposit note, and a maintenance work order queued for the next scheduled runway rubber removal. I moved to the ATC movement log for the same night, expecting to identify the aircraft. There was no arrival between 0300 and 0500 local. The tower had closed at midnight, as it does every night at this facility, and the airspace had reverted to Class E surface area, with approach control handling any traffic remotely. The approach facility's movement log showed no inbound aircraft to my airport between 2347 the previous evening and 0612 the following morning. I pulled the ADSB archive from the FAA swim feed. Nothing within 30 nautical miles of the field between those hours, except a single overflight at flight level 340 that never descended. I pulled the radar playback from the approach facility. Same result. I checked the flight plan database. No IFR or VFR plan filed to or from the airport during the relevant window. I checked with the two cargo operators that occasionally use the field for unscheduled diversions. Nothing on their manifests. I checked the airport's own billing records for landing fees. No fee assessed for that night, no fuel uplift, no ground handling ticket, no customs notification, though the field is not a designated port of entry and would not normally see one. I want to describe carefully what I felt at this point, because it was not fear. It was the specific irritation an auditor feels when two systems that should agree do not agree, and when the disagreement cannot be resolved by any of the ordinary explanations. My working hypothesis at 10:14 in the morning, on the third day of the audit, was that the weather observer on duty that February night had made a serious procedural error, possibly fabricated the remark, and that the airfield inspector had either colluded with the fabrication or independently misidentified pre-existing rubber deposits as fresh. This is the kind of finding that ends careers, and I do not enjoy making it, but I have made it before. I pulled the observer's name from the certification roster. He was a 22-year veteran, dual-rated as a contract weather observer under the LAWRS program and as an airfield operations specialist. His disciplinary file was empty. His annual proficiency checks were consistently rated at the highest available tier. I pulled the inspector's name. Similar record. 19 years on the field. No write-ups, no history of documentation issues. I pulled a second remark from a different night 6 weeks later. Different observer, different inspector, same pattern, same absence of any corresponding aircraft in ATC, radar, ADSB, flight plan, or billing systems. I pulled a third, a fourth, a 10th. By the end of the fourth day, I had reviewed 41 of the 147 flagged remarks in detail. In every case, the surface weather observation was internally consistent. In every case, the environmental disturbance described was of a magnitude that would require a large aircraft, generally Category D or E, under wake turbulence separation standards, meaning a wide-body jet or a heavy freighter. In every case, the downstream operational response was appropriate to that magnitude. Friction tests, rubber deposit notes, bird control dispatches, lighting inspections, occasional NOTAMs issued for temporary FOD sweeps. In every case, no aircraft appeared in any of the flight tracking or movement recording systems maintained by any independent authority. I want to pause here and explain, for anyone unfamiliar with the redundancy of modern aviation surveillance, why this is not a small problem. A large aircraft approaching a Class C or Class D airport is tracked by, at minimum, primary surveillance radar operated by the responsible approach control facility. Secondary surveillance radar interrogating the aircraft's Mode S transponder, ADSB ground stations receiving the aircraft's own broadcast position at 1-second intervals, the airport's own surface movement systems if equipped, and the FAA's traffic flow management databases. It is separately documented by the flight plan filed with air traffic services, the airline's own operational flight tracking, the aircraft's onboard flight data recorder, the pilot's logbook entries, the destination airport's arrival billing, the fuel receipt at either origin or destination, and the Customs and Border Enforcement notification if the flight crossed a national frontier. To describe an aircraft as having landed at a modern airport is to make a claim that is corroborated or contradicted by roughly a dozen independent systems maintained by different organizations with different institutional interests. For a landing to appear in only one of those systems, the surface weather observation, and to be absent from all the others, is not a discrepancy. It is a category of event that the industry does not have a name for. On the morning of the fifth day, I requested a meeting with the airport's director of operations. I framed the request in the ordinary language of the audit. I had identified a pattern of unresolved documentation that I wanted to discuss before drafting my preliminary findings. She agreed to see me at 3 o'clock that afternoon. She is a former Air Force air traffic controller, roughly my age, and I had worked with her once before on a matter unrelated to weather reporting. I respect her. I want that on the record. I brought her a printed summary of the 41 remarks I had verified, along with the corresponding absences from the ATC, radar, ADSB, flight plan, and billing systems. I laid the summary on her desk. I said, "I need to understand what these are." She read the summary. She read it slowly. She turned 2 pages back and forth as though checking one entry against another. Then she set the pages down and said, "How far back have you gone?" I said 24 months, per the audit scope. She said, "You should probably go further." She did not say it defensively. She did not say it as a challenge. She said it the way a physician says, when you describe a symptom, that you should probably also get the other thing checked while you are already at the appointment. It was not an evasion. It was a professional courtesy offered by someone who already knew what I was going to find and was not planning to prevent me from finding it. I asked her directly whether the observations were being fabricated. She said, "No, I've asked several times. They are not being fabricated." I asked her what they were then. She said, "That is not a question I have been able to answer. I have decided that answering it is not part of my responsibilities. The airport is required to maintain accurate weather observations under our certification. The observers are meeting that requirement. The maintenance crews are meeting the requirements that follow from the observations. Beyond that, I do not have a mechanism to intervene." I asked whether she had ever raised the issue with the FAA. She said, "I raised it informally with our certifications safety inspector 8 years ago. He suggested that I focus on ensuring the airport's operational responses remained appropriate to the documented conditions, regardless of the ambiguity of the underlying cause. That is what I have done." I asked her whether I could see the earlier records. She said, "The records are yours to see. The archive room is unlocked. I would ask that you consult with me before you make any formal filing that references the pattern by name." I said I would. I left her office at 4 minutes past 4, and I went directly to the archive room. The airport, like most facilities of its age and size, retains its certified weather observations for a rolling 10-year period in digital format, with older records preserved on microfiche in accordance with FAA Order 7900.5. I pulled the microfiche cabinet for the years preceding my digital scope. I began at the earliest available records, which dated to 1988, when the airport had upgraded from a manual observation program to a certified LAWRS operation. The remarks were there. They were not as frequent as in the recent years. In 1988, I counted 6 across the entire year. In 1989, 11. In 1990, 14. The frequency climbed slowly and unevenly through the 1990s, plateaued in the early 2000s at roughly 40 per year, and then began climbing again around 2011. By 2019, it had reached 78 per year. By last year, when I began my audit window, it was 74 in the first 6 months alone. The language of the earlier remarks was different, in the way that any technical language is different across 3 decades. The older observers wrote in a more discursive style, less telegraphic than modern meta shorthand, but the substance was identical. Wake turbulence following a heavy aircraft. Wind shift persisting for 3 to 5 minutes. Reduced visibility in an exhaust plume. Fresh tire residue. Friction degradation. Bird dispersal. Runway lighting inspections. Every single one of them describing the arrival of a large aircraft that, when I cross-checked against the corresponding ATC tapes and for the pre-radar archive era, the tower's paper strip records, had not been cleared, had not been observed by the tower controller, and had not been assessed a landing fee. I stopped counting at 1996. By that point, I had verified 311 historical remarks across 9 years, and the pattern was continuous, procedurally consistent, and unbroken. I want to describe the archive room because it matters to what came later. It is in the basement of the Airport Administration Building, at the end of a corridor that also contains the emergency generator room and the disused Cold War-era civil defense shelter. It is windowless. It is lit by 2 banks of fluorescent tubes, one of which was failing during my visits and cycling on and off at intervals of roughly 40 seconds. It contains 4 microfiche readers, 3 of which work, and a long table for laying out paper records. On the wall above the table is a framed photograph, black and white, of the airport under construction in 1962. In the photograph, a single runway is visible, and a group of men in short-sleeved shirts stand at the near end of it, looking at something beyond the frame. I mention the photograph because I looked at it many times during the following week, and I could not tell what the men were looking at. Over the next 4 days, I conducted interviews. I have conducted many interviews in my career. I have interviewed observers who were falsifying reports, controllers who were sleeping on duty, mechanics who had signed off inspections they had not performed. I know what evasion sounds like, and I know what defensiveness sounds like. Neither of those things was present in any of my interviews at this facility. I spoke with the senior weather observer, a man named, I will call him R. He was in his late 50s and had been observing weather at the airport for 28 years. I brought him into a small conference room off the operations building, and I asked him to describe, in his own words, the process by which he issued a wake turbulence remark following an arrival. He said, I observe the disturbance on the anemometer trace. I confirm it against the LLWAS. I check the visibility sensor and the RVR readout on the affected runway. If the disturbance meets the threshold for operational significance under FMH1, I file the remark. I request a runway inspection through ops. I log the request in the shift log. I asked him whether he confirmed the aircraft visually. He said, not always. Overnight, the tower is closed. I am in the observation building on the north side of the field. I can see runway 14/32 partially, and runway 9/27 not at all. Visual confirmation is not required for the remark. The remark documents the environmental disturbance, not the aircraft. I asked him whether he was aware that many of the disturbances he had documented did not correspond to any known aircraft arrival. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am aware that the tower log and the radar do not always reflect what the sensors record. Yes. I asked him what he thought was causing the discrepancies. He said, I don't think it is my job to determine that. My job is to accurately observe and record the environmental conditions on the airfield. I do that. The sensors do not lie. The disturbance is there or it is not there. When it is there, I record it. When the record then does not match the ATC log, that is a question for someone above my level. I asked whether he had ever in 28 years raised the discrepancy formally. He said, once in 2003. I filed a memo through my supervisor to the director of operations at the time. The response I received was that the observation program's obligations were being met and that I should continue to follow FMH-1 procedures. I have continued to follow them. I asked him whether the pattern frightened him. This is the only moment in any of my interviews at which I saw a change in demeanor. He looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "No, I have been here a long time. The disturbance is real. The inspection finds what the inspection finds. The runway is safe in the morning. That is what the job is. If I let myself be frightened, I could not do the job." I thanked him and I let him go back to his shift. I interviewed 6 more people over the following 3 days. An airfield inspector with 15 years on the field, a ground vehicle dispatcher, 2 bird control officers, 1 active and 1 retired, a retired approach controller who had worked the airport's airspace for 22 years before retiring in 2016, and a maintenance supervisor responsible for the runway rubber removal program. Each of them in different words said the same thing. The disturbance is real. The inspection finds what the inspection finds. The response is appropriate to what is documented. Beyond that, the question is not theirs to answer. The retired approach controller was the most direct. He said to me over the phone from his home in a small town about 90 minutes from the airport, "We used to see them sometimes on the primary, not the secondary, no transponder return, but sometimes a primary target that would appear on final and then blank out about 1.5 miles from the threshold. Not always. Maybe 1 in 10 of the events. We stopped reporting them in the 80s. There was nowhere for the report to go." I asked him if he could describe what a primary radar return of that kind would look like on the scope. He said, "It looked like an aircraft on final approach. It looked exactly like an aircraft on final approach." I asked him what he thought it was. He said, "I stopped asking. I retired. You should think carefully about how you spend the rest of your career." I did not take that as a threat. I have thought about it many times since, and I still do not take it as a threat. I take it as advice offered honestly by a professional who had reached a conclusion about the limits of what could usefully be pursued. On the evening of the 10th day of my audit, I arranged to conduct a live overnight observation from the Weather Observation Building. I want to be transparent about why I did this. It was not required by the audit. The audit could have been closed on documentary evidence alone. My findings would have been the same. I did it because I wanted to see for myself whether the sensors would produce a signature during my presence, and because I had reached a point in the investigation at which the documentary record had become almost too internally consistent to fully believe without a personal witness. I sat with the overnight observer, a woman I will call M, from 2200 local until sunrise. She was in her mid-40s, had been at the field for 11 years, and had been briefed by R that I would be observing her shift. She was cordial and professional. She offered me coffee. She showed me the sensor console, the LLWAS display, the anemometer trace, the RVR readouts, and the digital logbook interface. She talked me through the 2 speciis she filed during the first 4 hours of the shift, both of which were unremarkable. One for a ceiling drop associated with a stratus deck moving in from the northwest, and one for a wind shift when the stratus deck passed. Normal winter overnight weather. At 0231 local, she straightened in her chair. I did not see anything on the console change at first. She was watching the anemometer trace on the primary display. I looked at it. It read 290 at 4 knots, gusting 7. Then it read 290 at 4 knots, no gust. Then it read 270 at 9 knots, gusting 14. Then 260 at 13 knots, gusting 19. The gust factor climbed for approximately 90 seconds and then began to decay. The LLWAS registered a low-level wind shear alert at 0232 and cleared at 0235. The RVR readout on runway 32 dropped from greater than 6,000 feet to 4,500 feet at 0233 and recovered to greater than 6,000 by 0236. M filed the SPEC1 at 0237. The remark read, Wake Turb OBS RWY 32 following H VYA CFTR approx 0231 Zulu, wind shift 270/13, G19 persisted 4 minutes. LLWAS alert, RBRWI 32, RDC where D 4,500 feet in plume, friction in Sparak at 0239. She called ops on the airfield frequency. A ground vehicle was dispatched. I listened on the handheld radio she had given me. The ground vehicle called clear of runway 32 at 0247, reporting fresh tire residue in the touchdown zone, moderate rubber deposit, and a friction reading of 0.64 MU against a baseline of 0.72 from the previous inspection. I asked M quietly whether she had heard anything. She said, The observation building is soundproofed. I never hear them. I asked her whether she had ever gone outside during a documented event to listen. She said, Once, my first year. I did not hear anything. I saw the wind indicator on the pole outside the door move, and I felt the temperature drop about 2 degrees on the covered walkway. That was all. I did not go out again. It did not seem useful. I sat with her until sunrise. There were no further events. She filed the routine meters at each hour. At 0612, she handed the shift off to the day observer. I thanked her, and I left the observation building. I want to describe what I did next, because it is the closest I came to a decision I would not repeat. I walked out onto the airfield perimeter road, along the eastern edge of runway 32, in the pre-dawn dark. It was -8 degrees Celsius. The wind was calm. The runway lights were on their overnight low-intensity setting. I walked south along the perimeter road toward the touchdown zone of runway 32, and I stopped where I could see the fresh rubber deposit that the ground vehicle had reported. I could see it. It was on the runway surface, roughly 300 feet in from the threshold. 2 parallel bands of darker material against the pale grooved concrete, approximately the width and spacing of the main landing gear of a wide-body aircraft. It was not old, it was not weathered, it had a matte, slightly glossy quality that fresh tire residue has for a few hours before it begins to oxidize. I stood there for some time. I do not remember exactly how long. I remember that I was very cold and that I did not feel cold. I remember that I looked at the rubber deposit and then I looked at the approach end of the runway, and I looked up at the approach lights, and I looked at the sky above the approach path, which was clear and full of ordinary winter stars, and I thought about the number of independent systems that had documented the arrival of the aircraft whose tires had made those marks. I counted them in my head: the anemometer, the LLWAS, the RVR sensor, the visibility sensor, the ground vehicle's friction measuring equipment, the ground vehicle operator's own eyes, and the runway surface itself, which was now recording the arrival in the form of 2 bands of vulcanized rubber that would remain there until the next scheduled rubber removal cycle. 7 independent physical systems, no aircraft. I want to be very careful here. I do not think I saw or heard anything at that moment that was not consistent with a quiet winter pre-dawn at a mid-sized commercial airport. I did not see a phantom aircraft. I did not hear engines. I did not feel a presence. I felt the specific dread of a professional who has arrived at a conclusion he cannot file. I walked back to my rental car and I drove to my hotel. I slept for 4 hours. I woke at 1100 and I began drafting my preliminary findings. I completed the audit on schedule. My final report contained 147 flagged remarks, verified against ATC, radar, ADS-B, flight plan, airline movement, and billing records. It contained the historical analysis showing continuity of the pattern from 1988 to the present. It contained summaries of my interviews, with the interviewees anonymized under standard protective language. It contained a description of the live overnight observation, presented in operationally neutral terms as an on-site verification of sensor performance. It did not contain any hypothesis regarding the underlying cause of the anomaly because I did not have one that met the evidentiary standard my profession requires. My formal finding, per the audit scope, was that the Certified Weather Observation Program at the facility was compliant with FMH1 and with the airport's certification requirements under Part 139. The observers were correctly documenting the environmental disturbances that the sensors were registering. The airport's operational responses to those documented disturbances were appropriate and timely. The discrepancy between the weather observation record and the movement records maintained by other authorities lay outside the scope of the weather observation program itself and could not be resolved through that program's procedures. I noted the discrepancy in an appendix. I recommended that it be referred to the appropriate FAA safety office for further evaluation. I did not name the pattern. I met once more with the director of operations before I left the facility. I gave her a draft copy of the findings. She read the appendix carefully. She thanked me. She said, "This is fair." I asked her one last time whether she had any hypothesis about what was actually happening. She said, "I have stopped forming hypotheses. I ensure that the runway is safe every morning. That is what I can do. That is what the airport can do. Beyond that, I do not know." I asked her whether she thought the FAA safety office would act on my referral. She said, "I expect they will acknowledge it. I expect they will file it. I expect that in a few years, when the next audit cycle comes around, another investigator will find the same pattern and write the same appendix. I have seen this happen twice in my time here." I flew home the following morning. I flew commercial on a scheduled flight from the airport in question. My aircraft appeared in the ATC record, in the radar record, in the ADSB record, in the airline manifest, in the billing system, and in my own memory. I mention this because during the flight, I found myself looking out the window at the runway as we taxied for departure, and I noticed the fresh rubber deposit I had seen on the perimeter still visible in the touchdown zone of runway 32 as we passed it. It had not been removed. It would be removed on the next scheduled cycle, along with all the other rubber deposits, both the accounted for and the unaccounted for, in one indistinguishable rubber removal operation. That was 6 weeks ago. I want to explain briefly why I am writing this at all. Yesterday morning, I received a routine notification from the audit tracking system indicating that the facility had uploaded its most recent monthly weather observation summary for my post-audit review. This is standard practice for the 90-day follow-up window. I opened the summary. I scrolled through it. I was looking for the ordinary things: SPECI frequency, remark patterns, calibration flags. Halfway down the second page, I saw an entry from the previous night. I will reproduce it as it appeared. The meter was time-stamped at 0316 local. Wind 340 at 5, visibility 10, sky clear, temperature -6, dew point -9, altimeter 30.04. The remarks read, HVY wake turb persisted approx. 4 minutes following unidentified R wind shift 300/11 G17. ER VRR WY32 RDCD 5,000 feet in plume. Friction in Sprick. The observer's certification number was one I recognized. It was R. I opened the corresponding ATC record. There was no arrival. I opened the ADSB archive. There was no aircraft. I opened the airport's own movement record. There was no entry. I opened the runway inspection log. The inspection had been completed at 0402 by the overnight airfield inspector, who had reported fresh tire residue in the touchdown zone of runway 32, moderate rubber deposit, and a friction reading of 0.61 MU against a baseline of 0.70 from the previous inspection. A NOTAM had been issued at 0415 for a temporary FOD sweep. The sweep had been completed by 0447. The runway had been returned to full operational status at 0450. well before the first scheduled arrival of the day. Everything had been done correctly. Everything had been documented. Every procedure had been followed. The airport had responded, as it always responds, exactly as required. The word R had chosen was one I had not seen in any of the historical records I had reviewed. He had written unidentified, not heavy aircraft, not large aircraft, unidentified. I sat at my desk for a long time. I looked at my copy of the audit report, which is on a shelf behind my desk in a binder among other binders. I looked at my inbox, which contained the notification from the audit tracking system and roughly 40 other messages of the ordinary bureaucratic kind. I looked at my own hands. I understand now what the retired approach controller was saying to me on the telephone. I understand what the director of operations was saying when she told me that answering the question was not part of her responsibilities. I understand what R meant when he said that if he let himself be frightened, he could not do the job. The airport is not concealing anything. There is nothing to conceal. There are no undocumented flights because there are no flights. There are only the environmental disturbances that the sensors detect, the observations that the observers are required by their certifications to record, and the operational responses that the disturbances require the airport to perform. The system is not covering up an anomaly. The system has, over 60 years, quietly extended itself to safely accommodate a category of arrival that exists only inside the systems responsible for safely responding to it. The runway is inspected, the rubber is removed on schedule, the friction is measured and logged, the FOD sweeps are completed before dawn. The next day's traffic lands on a surface that has been prepared for it, on an airfield whose overnight documentation is complete, on a certification that remains in good standing. Public safety is preserved. The airport functions. I have not yet decided what to do with the follow-up finding. Under the audit tracking protocol, I am required to acknowledge the monthly summary within 10 business days. I can acknowledge it as compliant, which it is. I can flag it for additional review, which will produce another appendix, which will be filed, which will be found again in 3 years by another investigator. I can request an in-person follow-up visit to the facility, which I am authorized to do at my discretion. I have been thinking since yesterday morning about the framed photograph on the wall of the archive room. The one from 1962 of the men in short-sleeved shirts standing at the end of the single runway, looking at something beyond the frame. I have been thinking about what they were looking at. I have been thinking that the airport was already receiving those arrivals then, before the LLWAS existed, before the ASOS existed, before the ADSB ground stations existed, when the only system capable of documenting the environmental disturbance was the eyes of a man standing at the end of the runway, watching the windsock move without any wind. I do not think I will request the follow-up visit. I think I will acknowledge the summary as compliant. I think I will close the 90-day window on schedule. I think I will move on to the next audit in my queue, which is at a smaller field in a different region, and which will, in all likelihood, present no anomalies of any kind. I think R will file his next remark whenever the sensors register the next disturbance. I think the inspection will be completed before sunrise. I think the runway will be safe in the morning. That, in the end, is what the job is.